All right, looks like we're letting everybody in. And it's 11 o'clock Central, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about what's new in .NET 9. Daniel, Patrick, and I are going to kind of walk through a few different sections of .NET 9. I'll go over an agenda here in a little bit, so you kind of get a sense for that. But just to level set, there's an entire conference called .NET Conf that kind of releases .NET 9, and they have multiple days worth of content. We're not going to have time to cover every little nook and cranny of .NET, but we're going to try and distill it down to kind of things that you should care about here in the next hour. So we kind of wanted to do a quick poll and have a poll show up on the screen of what .NET version are you currently using? So are you using 8? Are you already on 9? Are you still stuck on .NET Framework, which it's a safe place, you can admit. This is anonymous, so we won't be exposing who's still on Framework. But yeah, kind of curious. I'm sure people are kind of in mixed environments where they might have still some Framework stuff. But I'm kind of curious on like what's the latest version that you all are on. Cool. So, and then we'll kind of share the results here in a second as people start answering that question. But like I said, we kind of broke things down into different sections that Patrick, Daniel, and I will take. So we'll kind of break things down into like, hey, what's new in ASP.NET Core? What's new in C# 13? What's new in ND Framework Core? And then we'll get into some kind of .NET new functionality as well, things that were kind of added to the base class library, and then performance improvements and things like that. Just some additional info to be aware of. .NET 9 was released right about a month ago on November 12th. And .NET 9 is what's called a short-term support release. So if you're not familiar with .NET's versioning, they have odd releases. So a .NET 9 release is what's called a short-term support release. So what that means is it's supported for roughly 18 months. So you can see May 12th, 2026 is when that support ends. So things getting like security updates, new features, things like that, that support ends on May 12th, 2026. Whereas .NET 10, which is an even release, an even number release, is a long-term support release. And those usually have a 3-year life cycle from when they're released. So just wanted to call that out because basically when .NET 10 releases in November of 2025, because new .NET versions release every November, you're basically going to have roughly 6 months to upgrade from .NET 9 to .NET 10 in order to stay supported. So I want to call that out because some companies are okay with moving to the latest version right away, and other companies, might not be as quick to migrate to a different version. So some companies are skipping the short-term support release versions, and others are, staying on the latest and greatest. So I just wanted to call that out so that you're aware of kind of the support life cycles with .NET. So yeah, now we're going to release the poll results. So it looks like 93% of people out there are on .NET 8, and 1 person is on .NET 9. So it seems like a lot of people are still on .NET 8. So this is really timely, I'm guessing, why you're here to kind of learn about what the latest versions are and kind of what's in the latest version. Yeah, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Daniel to talk about what's new in ASP.NET Core.
Cool. All right. So like Scott said, I am Daniel Ward. I'm going to be covering ASP.NET Core, kind of everything under the ASP.NET Core namespace umbrella. So you also see stuff from Kestrel and the first thing here, OpenAPI. So this is kind of a big one if you are familiar with a package called swashbuckle.asp.NET Core. This will no longer be in your project. New project template starting with .NET 9 no longer includes this package. Now the package is being replaced by this new one called Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAPI. Swagger is still supported. It's just not coming from Swashbuckle. So you can still have Swagger. It'll just be generated by something else. So the reason they did that is in this GitHub issue, if you get these slides afterwards and you're curious to read about it. But the long story short is that Swashbuckle is just not really being maintained anymore. There were issues on that repo from, I think I said 2 or 3 years ago that hadn't had any discussion or anything on them. So Microsoft just kind of said, okay, fine, I'll do it myself. So it's just really 2 methods for that new package, and this will be in the new template. So that add open API and then map open API. Kind of an added bonus is that it supports trimming and native ahead of time compilation. So that's cool. Separate package, this Microsoft Extensions API description server can generate open API documents at build time. That's kind of cool. And this is something separate, but this was a new concept to me in general, not just with .NET, so I thought it was kind of cool. This pushed authorization requests, OpenID Connect handler supports these now, this PAR. This moves authorization parameters from the front channel to the back channel. Generally, whenever you move something from the front to the back, it's going to get more secure. It also shortens the redirect URIs. If those get really long, that can cause problems on some browsers. So it's a good thing. They kind of said, since this is just more secure, if the identity provider supports it, it's going to be enabled by default. If you want to, you can disable it, or you can say all authorization is going to fail if it's not PAR, so you can enforce it. And finally, with OpenAPI, there's a little bit simpler way to customize authorization message parameters. The old way was just a little bit of boilerplate when all you really want to do is set these 2 parameters here. And the new way is just a little smaller. So not a major change, but these little small quality of life improvements are nice over time. Static asset improvements. This is another one of the big ones, I would say. So if you are familiar with use static files in your startup or program class, that is being replaced by a new method called map static assets. This is kind of just supposed to be a drop-in replacement that you can replace without thinking about it. Docs kind of said the only place it doesn't really work that way is if you are using static assets that are not in the project. So if you're fetching them from disk somewhere, something like that. I don't think I've ever seen that, but I'm sure there's someone out there doing that. But if all your static assets are known at build time, publish time, you can just drop it in and it compresses your static assets, as we will see on the next slide. Pretty good compression. It uses gzip during development and gzip and Brotli during publish. Those are just different compression algorithms. And you get around 70 to 90% size reduction for those assets. And this was something that was also a new concept for me. This is not .NET specific. This is just the web, but it also now supports content-based e-tags. So e-tags is a way for the browser to not have to download the asset every time. It encodes the content of the asset and it makes a hash out of that. And the browser just looks at the hash and it says, has the hash changed? And if it hasn't, it doesn't need to download that file again. If the hash has changed, it reaches out to download it again. You can do this compression on the server, but it's more complicated, it's less performant, and you get less size reduction out of it. So better to do it build and publish time if you can. Here's the numbers they gave. There's kind of 3 scenarios they gave. One's using the default Razor Pages template. One's using Fluent UI Blazor components. One is using Mud Blazor components. I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but really you can just look at the bolded rows here. The last column, this percent reduction. You can see you're getting around like 80 to 90% size reduction for the CSS and JS files. So that's pretty cool for a method you don't really have to do anything with, just replaces your existing method. So pretty nice. Now moving on into Blazor, good segue. I'm not going to go over this template, but there is a new template for Blazor called Maui Blazor Web. It's just supposed to make it easier to create Maui native and Blazor web projects that share the same UI. There's also a new simplified API that lets you query component states at runtime. So I'm not going to go over every little thing in these either, but there's 3 of them. Renderer info name. It's where the component is executing, and that can be helpful for debugging and optimizing a component's performance. Is interactive. it's if it's interactive. So it's just a Boolean. It's true if it's rendering interactively, and it's false otherwise. So that can be useful if the component has different behaviors based on that. And finally is the assigned render mode, and that can just be useful for optimizing a component's performance. Once again. Lastly, with Blazor, input number was an existing component. It's just a text box, has some validation for you on it. Now you can slap type equals range on it to make it a slider or dial instead. That's kind of cool. And Razor components now support constructor injection. That's cool. Here's a Razor component. We're injecting navigation manager into the constructor and using it. So that is nice. Signal R, not a whole lot with, but it supports trimming and native ahead of time compilation on the server and client side. And hub methods can now accept a base class instead of just the derived class, which lets you do polymorphism. So you have to annotate the base class. So as an example, here's a hub method up top. It's taking in a JSON person that's defined here below, and you can see it is annotated. It's got JSON polymorphic and these two JSON derived types, which are just polymorphic derived types. And then in the hub method, we're checking if person is one of these derived types, and it works. So it's a little roundabout, but it does let you use polymorphism with your hub method. So that's a neat thing. Minimal API is not a whole lot on either. This typed results class is a useful little tool that lets you add strongly typed, return strongly typed status codes. So they just add an internal server error to it for 500s. So you can return typed results, internal server error, and then a message, and there's your 500. So that's nice. Hybrid cache, I would say, is another bigger thing. This is supposed to be a drop-in replacement for the two libraries, iDistributed cache and iMemory cache. This is a new package, and it kind of simplifies the API and bridges gaps between them. As an example, here's an example with iDistributed cache. There's nothing really bad about this code. There's nothing weird going on. We're trying to get the value from the cache. If bytes is null, if there's a cache miss, then we hit the real data source, get the stuff, and then put that in the cache. Otherwise, we just use the value from the cache. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's just kind of the exact same workflow every time we work with the cache. So hybrid cache just said, hey, I'm going to simplify this. We're basically doing the same thing every time. So we just call this getter create async method instead. You can still give it a method to run on cache miss. And it's just kind of less boilerplate, a nicer experience. Developer exception page changes. This is not huge either, but they've added endpoint metadata to it. Kind of said while we were in there, we made some really small quality of life tweaks like text size changes, table sizes, makes it nicer to look at. But here's this new endpoint metadata that's now included on the error page. Can be helpful for diagnosing like routing issues, caching issues. So that's nice. Some debugging changes. This is not necessarily specific to ASP.NET Core, but it does affect it. So some key value collection types like dictionaries have a better debugging display. So here's the example. The old way is it just had the key and the value on the right side. Now it has the key on the left side and the value on the right side. So it's just a little cleaner to look at. This matters for ASP.NET Core because a lot of types that are specific to web things are affected by this, like headers, query strings, cookies, view data, things like that. And lastly, I would actually count this as a fourth big thing, is Kestrel has an additional connection metric, which is why a connection failed. So this is error.type in connection or Kestrel connection duration. So, for example, connection reset or TLS handshake failed. But previously, to find this out, you basically just had to dig through server logs, these low-level logs that are expensive because there's a lot of them, and they're just not fun to look through. It's hard to find the information you want, to parse through all that info. And since they're metrics, you can use them in production for like dashboards and alerts, things like that. So just one little metric, but pretty helpful in the big picture, in my opinion. So we are now going to go to what's new in C# 13.
Yeah.
You want to steal my?
Sorry, was that last part? Well, yeah. So, hi, my name is Patrick, and I'm going to be talking about what's new in C# 13. And yeah, so I would say there's not a lot of major changes into C# 13. We're going to talk a little bit about what those at a high level are. There's params collections, new escape sequence. There's an implicit index accessor, which is kind of cool, adding onto the indexer access that was, I believe, added in C# 12. There's partial properties that are now allowed in partial types. And there's some ref and struct updates, among other things. And we're going to talk about that more in detail. But first, we're going to start with the params collections. So you can now use any recognized collection type for params, not just an array. So if you're using params like int array or whatever the type array of items so that you can add any number of items into your input, you can now use span, read-only span, anything that implements IEnumerable with an add method. You can even use read-only collections, read-only lists, and the iCollection and iList as well. So that's a new thing. So now you can not always have to do little square braces. You can now use generics, or not generics. You can use other collection types. The new escape sequence, now you can use /e as an escape sequence for the escape character. Previously, you would have to use the /u001b or /x1b, but /x1b, the reason it was not recommended was because of the possible hexadecimal collision. So like you could type in something and it would be hexadecimal and completely change the character. The implicit index access. So now from the index operator, you get the caret can now be used in the object initializer expression. So the example over on the right, basically when you're creating a new array, you can now use the implicit or the caret to set values in the object initializer expression. So that's pretty cool. Partial properties, you can now declare partial properties in partial indexers in partial classes. Partial. Yeah, so previously you can declare partial properties, but now you can do that in a partial class. And moving right along, there's some ref updates. So ref and unsafe and iterators and async methods, that is now possible. Let's say that locals and unsafe contexts are now allowed in iterators and async methods with safety checks to prevent access across await or yield boundaries. You can now use ref struct is a new anti-constraint. Ref structs can now implement interfaces, and I believe I've got but can't convert to interface types. So I've got a little example here of the allows ref struct. So yeah, so there's some updates to refs. Let's see what else. We have new lock type in semantics, as well as method group natural type. And so the method group natural type improvements, the overload resolution for method groups has been optimized. So now the compiler prunes inapplicable candidate methods at each scope, enhancing the efficiency of method selection. And overload resolution priority, there's an attribute, the overload resolution priority attribute. It allows library authors to specify preferred method overloads. So guiding the compiler to select the most appropriate method during the overload resolution. I'm also going to be talking about what's new in Entity Framework Core as well. So that's going to include some Azure Cosmos DB updates ahead of time and precompiled queries, link and SQL translation, migrations and tooling, model building, and SQL Server hierarchy ID. So the Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL. I double clicked, but as part of the improvements, there are some high impact breaking changes. So if you do update, know that there are some high impact breaking changes. There's a link here. So if you download the slides afterward, that is a link to the breaking changes information. There's been improvements on querying with partition keys and document IDs, as well as hierarchical partition keys. Now supports sub-partitioning up to 3 levels of hierarchy. There's improved link querying capabilities. There's now role-based access, and then synchronous IO is now blocked by default. I believe it was previously you had to block it if you wanted to block it, but now it's blocked by default, and you can toggle it off. Now, there's also some updates to the simplified ID properties without discriminators. So you previously had to do blog pipe ID, or not blog, but the type pipe ID. Now it's just the ID. So for the discriminator property now is the $type field. So now you go from having the ID and the type being in the ID. It's now ID is a number and type has the type in it. And then also in preview, there is now a vector similarity search. And then also now there is pagination support, added pagination support, as well as from SQL is now was added for safer SQL querying. So I'll have some code examples of here's the pagination. So now you can do 2-page async and have a continuation token. And then the next page you grab the continuation token. And then the from SQL, you now have from SQL where you can parameterize your some variables, and it will, I believe if I remember right, it does some better sanitization or parameterization of your parameters that you're putting in. And then moving on to ahead of time and precompiled queries. It's a highly experimental feature, not yet suited for production use. That is Microsoft's words. But it generates C# interceptors that execute each specific query. So one of the cool things is it will basically, I believe it's at runtime, or not, at runtime, it'll generate these interceptors that basically have the hard-coded query generated ahead of time, so you're not having to spin that up every single time. I think it's at build time, not, sorry, I apologize, not runtime, build time. So it creates these interceptors so it'll help make your querying more efficient if you don't change it a lot. And then each interceptor, it contains the finalized SQL. So that's where it's like building out the SQL for that reusable query so you can have more efficient queries. Let's see, link and SQL translation. So there's now support for group by with a complex type, and execute update also now accepts a complex type property. So here's a code example of those. So now you can use a complex type for your group by and your execute updates. And then also updates to link and SQL translation is the pruning unneeded elements from SQL. So let's say you've got this query where you're going to get the customer where it has any orders on it. Previously in Entity Framework 8, it would do a left join and join that table on. But if you notice, we're not selecting any of the orders. It's just we want to make sure that it has them. So we're not actually selecting from that joined table in the resulting SQL. So it's kind of almost a wasted join. So in Entity Framework 9, it does not do a join. It uses the exists query instead, or the function. So it's more performant, and you're not pulling back data that you're not even selecting from. And then also translations involving greatest and least. Basically on that one, what is used is for the max and min values. We'll use greatest and least, and then EF constant and EF parameter methods have been added, or the EF constant was already in EF8, but EF parameter, I believe, was added in EF9. So the basically in this example, you've got a constant here that I believe by default it would call the .NET blog a constant, and then the e.id would be a parameter. And so by adding ef.constant, you can now pass the ID as a constant as far as the SQL. So it'll pass whatever that value is as a constant rather than being a parameterized value. Or you can specify something to be a parameter instead of a constant. So an EF9.NET blog in this particular example, without the specification would be a constant, but the variable e.id equals ID would be passed as a parameter by default, but you can use the ef.constant or ef.parameter methods to do the opposite or do the other one. Let's see. EF constant also works on primitive collections too. Wanted to call that out with this little code example. So if you wanted your list of constant or list of IDs that you're doing a contains call on to be constant, you can do ef.constant on the primitive collection, and that would be translated as a constant rather than a parameterized value. Let's see. Inlined uncorrelated subqueries reduced round trips. So I don't know if you've seen code like this, where you've got an iQueryable of the .NET posts where we're doing some query on the database, but we haven't done a to-list or a to-array or anything to make the concrete trip to the database. But in this particular example, in EF8, this would do 2 trips to the database, but now in EF9, this does 1 round trip with the way that it's translating the SQL. Aggregate functions over subqueries and aggregates on SQL Server. This one's kind of fun. I'm going to have a code example here in a second, but queries using count not equal. I don't think I have a code example, my bad. But the aggregate functions over subqueries, there's improvements for some complex queries using aggregate functions composed over subqueries. So some of the types of queries, you'll have a query within a query, and it's basically made it more efficient with how it executes those subqueries rather than in EF8. I believe it was a little bit more, it generated more SQL and it did more operations. And EF9, they found a way to cut it down to smaller operations or fewer operations. Queries using count not equal to 0 have been optimized to basically, it's smart enough to, instead of doing the greater than 0, it's doing, or no, that it's doing a not. I think I'm trying to remember what it does under the hood with the SQL, envisioning it, but basically it created a more performant query than just doing count not equal 0, because that was not as performant as, I think it's like greater than 0 or not equal to 0 behind the scenes. But the C# semantics for comparison of nullables is the way it did it in EF8 and earlier used the database way or database functionality for comparing, which then resulted in a different result than how link to objects does it. So in EF9, the update is to have them both do the same thing. So link to objects was correct, or according to EF9, link to objects is correct. And so now the database portion of link will result in the similar results. So EF8 did it this way, where it would sometimes not return the same results if it was like an array or a list in memory. And then EF9 changes it to this is the new SQL that it's returning, which is equivalent to what link to objects does. Order and order descending link operators. So we're probably all somewhat familiar with order by and order by descending. There's just two new methods that are added to do the ordering, but you don't give it any inputs. It just will use the default sort on that collection. And so it will order by the default key or whatever in ascending or descending. And then improved translation of logical negation operators. Basically, it did some optimization around using case, when, coalesce, negation, and other constructs to make not more efficient in the SQL that it generates. All right, moving on to migrations and tooling. There's now protection against concurrent migrations. So if you're spinning it up concurrently, it has they've added some smartness into the basically protecting against doing it twice or like at the same time as somebody else. Also, there's now a warning when multiple migration operations can't be run inside of a transaction. So it used to be you would find that out the hard way by trying to just run the migration, but now there's some added warning capabilities. There's also some improved data seeding capabilities. I believe there's a new method or two that were added to be able to handle seeding of the data, and then also reduced code size for migration of existing table to a SQL Server temporal table. So basically, they've done some reduction in like the amount of code needed to be able to make that migration. Also, there's some tooling updates for fewer rebuilds. So in the past, if you're a savvy .NET Entity Framework, doing some code in Entity Framework, you would just do --no-build whenever you're doing a .NET Entity Framework call. There's been some improvements to MS Build that make it so that it's a little bit smarter and knows when not to build if it needs to. However, because on Entity Framework's website, they said that because any change to MS Build, because it is a highly used software or application, that if there's any negative experience to let them know right away. So there's that little caveat that in their documentation, they're like, hey, it's good, but if something happens, let us know. But also, I think that is it for the tooling. So with model building, some of the updates here, there's now auto-compiled models. So these ones are when you compile, there's basically an EF9, you don't have to use .use model when the app's DB context type is in the same project assembly as the compiled model. There'd be times where you have to do .use model to specify that on startup. And then MS Build integration, there's now a library that helps with the build integration. There's a task package that I've linked here also for information on that can automatically update the compiled model when the model project is built. You have to enable in the CSproj file, there's an EF optimized context and EF scaffold model stage properties that you have to set to enable it. But that's also going to be found at that resource site. Read-only primitive collections. So Entity Framework 8 introduced mapping primitive collections. EF9 now supports collections that are read-only. So like iRead-only list, iRead-only collection, or read-only collection are now supported for those primitive types on the model. Fill factor for keys and indexes. Entity Framework 9 now supports specification of the SQL Server fill factor when using migrations to create keys and indexes. Existing model building conventions are more extensible. So that one, more extensible. So they've added some extensibility conventions to Entity Framework when you're building the models. There's a lot of ways to configure your models on model building, and when they're getting created, there's some more extensive extension methods that you can use with that. There's also a link to more information on that as well. And then update apply configurations from assembly can now call non-public constructors. This one is kind of fun because you can now nest a class inside of your model, and if it has a private constructor, but it implements the I think it's the iEntity type configuration interface, it can now access the non-public constructor, and that's useful when you don't want other classes outside of that class to be able to construct it or access it. I don't know that I would have a use case that I would use that, but if there is the use case where you need somebody to not be able to modify the code or the functionality inside of that configuration class, that would be a way to do it. Then there's also the SQL Server hierarchy ID. Basically, it's just some syntactic sugar for hierarchy ID path generation. So we've got this example of fetching an object, and then we've got two child objects that we want to give them a hierarchy path. So it'll parse the path, and then when you create one that goes in between, you now have the ability to just parse that path, and you can put it in between those two. So it's really just this parse path generation is just a new syntactic trigger to make that easier for your SQL Server hierarchy ID needs. And with that, I believe we are moving over to Scott to talk about what's new in .NET 9.
Helps if I unmute. All right. Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So yeah, we're going to talk about just some cool stuff that was added in .NET 9. So some new APIs that were added. A lot of us have done like GUID.new GUID to create, random GUIDs and whatnot. And now there's a GUID.create version 7. So like, why should you care about that? Well, I created these 4 GUIDs here. And if you notice, they're the beginning of them looks very close. There's just an 8 and then 3 9s here. And then these bottom 3 ones are pretty close as well, at least at the beginning segment of the GUIDs. And then the rest is kind of random, as you can see. Well, with UUID v7, which UUID is just another way of saying GUID, is they allow you to, the first part of the GUID in v7 is based off of the timestamp of when it's generated. So why is that useful? Well, it allows you to sort things by like when it was created, which if you're using these GUIDs to plug into like a database that maybe you're using GUIDs as a primary key, I'm not going to get into the debate of should you use GUIDs for primary keys or integers, because that's a whole nother topic in of itself. But if you do that, then your GUIDs will be pre-sorted essentially, which will make things a lot faster when you're actually doing queries and things like that. So it kind of eliminates one of the downsides of you using GUIDs as a primary key, because otherwise behind the scenes, your data kind of gets fragmented and it leads to slower queries and things like that. So if you use a v7 GUID, things will be a lot faster for you, as well as you can sort things nicely, as well as if you're just doing like GUID stuff in memory, using a v7 GUID will give you some sortability kind of out of the box. There's also some new link methods that I thought would be useful to call out, and one in particular, count by, I think is useful, but then there's aggregate by too as well. So let's look at this code example here real quick. So we've got a list of users, and again, this is just like a contrived example, so don't get married to what the example is. But you can kind of see here that we've got 5 different users. They have 2 different roles, either an admin or a member. So kind of the old way, so on line 10 through 12 there, what you used to have to do is if you wanted to group by the role and kind of get the count of like, okay, how many members and how many admins do I have? And I'm doing this all in memory. I have to do this group by role, and then I have to do kind of this select projection and project it into this anonymous type thing that I've got here, where I'm saying, hey, the role is the key, and then, calculate the count. Now with count by, you can see on lines 14 and 15, that's kind of the new way of doing essentially the exact same thing, where you just say count by and say role, and then that gives you back an IEnumerable of key value pairs. So you'll have like a key and a value on each one of those objects to say, hey, the key is the role, and then the value is the count. So those will give you back, basically will give you back like, hey, we've got 2 admins in this case and 3 members. So those 2 code examples at the bottom are equivalent, just, a little bit nicer, a little bit less to type, which is pretty cool. Then aggregate by, it's kind of similar to reduce in JavaScript, kind of, if you're used to that way of doing, or if you're familiar with that in JavaScript. So I've got like a list of order details here. The first 2 have the same GUID for like what the order detail is. And then we've got some quantities of how many were ordered in that order of that particular item. So the kind of old way of aggregating, you'd have to do like a group by and then do like a select and then kind of project that to a new object, where again, you're, or in this case, the order ID property we're setting is based on the key that we're grouping by. And then you had to do this like nested link query here where we say like, okay, I want to get the sum and then sum up the order's quantity for each one of those and kind of tackle that all kind of inside that select statement. With aggregate by, again, this is the equivalent on line 12 through 16. This is the equivalent of 8 through 10. So some people might not like this because there's a little bit more parameters, but I think it was useful to show anyway. The first parameter you pass in is you say, hey, this is the order ID. The seed is basically like, what value am I starting at? And then we basically have like a current running total as it loops through all of those orders and sums them all up. So you can obviously do lots of different stuff here. You can have some custom logic. It's basically like a callback function that runs every single time it's looping through and aggregating that data. So in this case, I'm just, hey, grab me the current total and add the current orders quantity to that. So at the end of the day, those will both produce the same exact thing. It'll basically produce like two records, one with this 3-4 and this other one with this D1. And the 3-4 is going to have a quantity of 11 and the D1 is going to have a quantity of 20 since that's the only one in that grouping. So just two new link methods. I think count by especially is one I could see myself using. Aggregate by maybe for certain situations. All right, so some .NET SDK improvements. So by default, NuGet will run some security audits on both direct dependencies. So those are the ones that are in your CS project, as well as your transitive dependencies. So those are kind of like your dependencies. So if you depend on EF Core depends on other things. And so NuGet will run security audits on all that stuff by default now. So if you've done Node again, where it tells you like, hey, you got all these insecure packages, .NET's got a similar thing. As well, it allows you for running more tests in parallel, especially if you're doing any like multi-targeting, meaning you're building like, let's say a library for this version of .NET, .NET 8 and .NET 9. Previously, you couldn't run tests in parallel, but now you can in that situation. As well as there's been some improvements to the terminal logger. So like an example of that is like the added colorization. So when you run .NET test, and John is very happy about that. When you run .NET test, and there's like a progress bar that kind of comes as you run this as well. But it'll give you some colorization saying, hey, here's what succeeded. You can imagine failures show up in red, things like that. As well as there's some colorization added as well to like the console logger if you're using kind of the base console for logging. All right, so some .NET Aspire improvements. There's been, I guess just to kind of level set on .NET Aspire. This is like a whole talk in of itself and really like a whole all-day workshop, but .NET Aspire is a way, it's terrible naming in my opinion, but Microsoft has the way your applications should aspire to be. So, which is where the Aspire name comes from. And John is not happy about that one. But basically, they give you a lot of things out of the box. Now, since we have time, I'm going to show a live demo of this here in a second, where you get like a local dashboard that shows you a lot of telemetry data of like the logs of your system, the metrics, kind of like what Daniel was talking about with like the Kestrel connection resets. You can actually see that stuff. You can see all sorts of different stuff, but then it also gives you some ways to do lots of other things like, hey, a lot of us have companies that publish internal NuGet packages. Well, it kind of gives you a opinionated way of doing some of that stuff. And I'll kind of dive into some of that stuff here in a second. But the local dashboard, again, I'll show a live demo of this here in a second. But allows you to, again, this is like a local only dashboard, but allows you to stop, start, and restart resources on demand. So let's say you've got like a front end and back end project, or like you're in a microservices environment, you need to start like 4 different projects. The dashboard allows you to kind of see those projects at a glance and stop, start, and restart them kind of on the fly. So you can kind of think of the dashboards like also an orchestrator. So if you're familiar with like Docker Compose and things like that, it's a .NET way of doing Docker Compose. So you can write C# to create your Docker Compose instead of YAML, essentially. Again, I could go into a whole talk about Aspire, but just kind of talking about some improvements they've made in .NET 9. They've also got a responsive layout. So as you're resizing things, the dashboard responds to that. They've colorized the console log. You can also create custom resource commands. So you've got like start, stop, restart. But let's say you want to reseed your database, for instance. Well, you could write some custom C# logic that's like, hey, let me create this custom command, and you can basically like click a button in the dashboard and it's like reseeds your data, or like whatever you want, because it's custom at the end of the day. So if you've got something custom that your application needs to do, and rather than like tearing the whole thing down and spinning it back up, you can just like click a button and have it do the thing. There's a whole bunch of more improvements that they've made as well. But one nice thing with Aspire is, like I said, it's also an orchestrator, kind of like Docker Compose, is they allow you to say, hey, wait for this resource to spin up before you spin up my other resource. So it's very similar to Docker Compose depends on. So like an example might be, hey, I've got a backend API. I require this database. Wait for that database to spin up in a Docker container before I boot up the backend application. Or maybe I've got a front end and a back end that are separate projects. Wait for the back end to spin up before I spin up the front end. So they've got a way to do that as well. And then they've got some more integrations, such as with OpenAI, and then some tighter integrations with Entra. So we'll do like passwordless stuff with databases. So to kind of see that in action, I've got this base Aspire app here. In full disclosure, I wasn't planning on showing this, so this is gonna be a live demo I haven't practiced before. So let's see how that goes. So if you go File, New Project, after you install the Aspire templates, you'll get options to for .NET Aspire, and then I'm picked the starter app. So if you want to try this out, you can do that. And technically, these improvements with Aspire work in either .NET 8 or .NET 9. So you can get these in either one of those. So if I go ahead and run this, what it's going to do is it's going to spin up a few different things. So you can see I've got an API service project here and a web project. So the API, as you might guess, is the backend API, and then the web is the front end Blazor application in this case. So it's actually going to spin up this dashboard as well, which kind of shows you, hey, these are your running applications that you've got. So I can do things like I mentioned. I could start and stop the application. I could do that here. Most importantly, I can configure dark mode, so you can make dark mode for your dashboard. So don't judge me that I was on light mode. That's the default, but you can switch it to dark mode. But I mentioned earlier, like you can add custom commands. So here's where those would go, like in the ... ellipses, you can add custom commands here. But what's cool about this is like I can go to my running web project, which this weather API hits the backend and actually makes the API call. And if you haven't seen Aspire, again, I'm not trying to show us, this isn't necessarily an Aspire talk. But what's kind of cool about this is Aspire will give you traces that kind of span across, like, okay, you hit the /weather front end page, and then this called this API on the back end, and it took this amount of time. And you can kind of diagnose like, okay, where's my bottleneck at? As well as I could see like the logs for that specific request and see, okay, from the front end, you know, it did these things, from the back end, it did these things. All sorts of cool stuff with Aspire. So like this just comes kind of like free out of the box with Aspire, and it'll wire up this stuff for you. So this is a local only dashboard, just to be clear. You can run this as a Docker container, but you'd have to figure out the storage and all of that kind of stuff for you. But again, something else is like the metrics also comes out of the box. So like you can dive in and see, like, for instance, you know, how many active server requests do I have? There's all sorts of crazy stuff in here, like how often or how long does a GC run? How often does it run? All sorts of stuff that's giving you like insights into how .NET's running behind the scenes. So if you haven't seen Aspire, again, I'm going over this super fast, and there's a lot more here too. But Aspire is kind of one of the things that they're promoting a lot at Microsoft, and so you'll see them continuing to make investments in Aspire. And long term, their goal is to get rid of infrastructure as code and replace it with C#. But that's a topic for another day. Okay. So hopefully you got kind of a sense of Aspire and some of those improvements. And if you haven't seen Aspire, hopefully that kind of gets you a little bit intrigued to learn more. There's a lot more other .NET improvements. They did some improvements to restoring packages. Basically, they changed underlying how they created the dependency graph, because again, your packages have packages they depend on. So instead of analyzing like 1.0 9 million nodes under the hood. They're analyzing 1,200 nodes, which, as you can imagine, is a lot faster. So in one test on the internal repo, they went from 16 minutes to restore packages down to 2 minutes. So with this, but even on simpler projects, your restore should be upwards of 8 times faster. So what this means is you have faster local dev times and faster CI times as well. So that's something cool in .NET 9. If you want more info, there's a link there. And we'll share the slides out by end of day tomorrow, along with the recording of this, so you can get access to all this information. All right, .NET is faster. That seems to be the theme every single year, is .NET is faster. So you can see here they shared an image of some JSON benchmarks, which this is minimal API specific, that they have 15% more requests per second. And then their memory is lower by 93%. We'll get into that in a little bit. But if I click on this link, you notice, like, I don't know if you can see that, but the scroll bar is super tiny. They added a ton of stuff in here. So like they get into the nitty gritty details of like all this crazy stuff. And there's kind of like a table of contents here on the right. But they talk about, like, for instance, I'll just dive into one of these. They kind of show like, hey, in .NET 8, it was this fast and it allocated this many bytes. And now in .NET 9, so you didn't have to do anything. Like if you just keep using the distinct method, in this case in link, you just get this free performance benefit out of the box. So it'll not only be faster, but it'll allocate less memory, which is pretty cool. But I'm not going to go over all of these things because there's obviously a lot here, but they actually come out with this blog post every year, I think since like .NET 3.1. I know, since .NET Core 2, it says. So every year they're making .NET faster, and they have this kind of mega blog post, which when I open this on my phone, it blows up Safari. So just FYI, that kind of shows you how many things that they're doing for performance in .NET. But we talked about, like, hey, the memory is down 93%, which is pretty crazy to see that reduced memory footprint. So how do they do that? Well, they changed the garbage collector. So the TLDR of that is basically your memory should go down, of your application should go down dramatically. But you might be interested to know, like, how did they do that, or what's the trade-off, some of those kinds of things. Well, they have this setting called datas that they've had for a little bit now, that is now turned on by default instead of the server GC mode that they used to have. So what that means is you have upwards of 90% less memory allocated to each .NET process. And so the impact of this is you now have a decision, like, let's say you're scaled out to 10 different instances of your application. You can decide, and maybe memory is the bottleneck there of why you're scaled out. Now you can say, like, okay, do I want to scale down to less instances? Maybe I'll scale down to like 5 instances instead of 10. Or maybe I still want 10 instances, but I want to scale down the tiers so I don't need as much memory allocated. So at the end of the day, if you're in the cloud, this results in reduced costs if you have less instances or lower tiers for your particular applications. But huge caveat, measure before you make any changes. And I'll kind of show an example that some people were posting about live. Don't just blindly scale down, actually, like, do the upgrade to .NET 9, kind of see how your application reacts, and then make the appropriate changes after you do that. So kind of nerd out on how Datas works under the hood. Basically, Datas tries to make your heap size proportional to the memory that you have long-lived in your application. So what they're trying to go for is, if you run the exact same app on a laptop that has 4 gigs of memory and a laptop that has 64 gigs, or a server that has 1 gig versus 128 or whatever, your memory usage should be the exact same regardless of the hardware you're running on. That was not always the case. In the server GC mode, they kind of treated the .NET process as like the only one on the machine. So they tried to optimize for fewer garbage collections. So that way, because when a garbage collection runs, and usually it's pretty quick, depending on what it's doing, but it will like kind of pause your application briefly from serving traffic, for instance, in an ASP on a core case. But with Datas, they try to optimize it. So like they optimize, there's a whole bunch of super nerdy stuff on like how they optimize like GCs and smaller memory. but under the hood, this is where you're going to see the biggest memory impact. And to steal somebody from Twitter who posted about this, is initially they kind of were like, what? I thought I was supposed to see a memory improvement from this GC change. What they realized is after they did the deploy, so you can kind of see here, they deployed to .NET 9, and then their memory spiked up kind of where it was. And then after a while, .NET realized like, hey, this is kind of your steady state memory. So I'm going to drop you down from, they were at 1.5 gigs to 2 gigs, and they dropped it down to like 400 to 600 megabytes per process. And it stayed that way ever since. So even after you do the .NET 9 upgrade and deploy, you might not see the memory savings immediately, but kind of keep an eye on it. And in his case, after 2 hours, he saw that improvement. So I think that's pretty cool that you basically just like bump the .NET versions and your app gets faster and uses less resources, and you didn't really have to do anything. So it's kind of cool that Microsoft keeps investing in that performance space, which again, just is going to save money in the long term if you're in the cloud. All right. So those are kind of the sections that we went over. So just to kind of wrap up things, we've got some resources here. Again, we'll send out these slides by end of day tomorrow, along with the recording. But we got some release notes here on .NET 9 and then .NET Conf videos. This will take you to the YouTube channel that's got all the .NET Conf videos if you want to dive into anything we talked about in deeper detail. But some key takeaways from today is, so if like you don't remember anything, or if you want to screenshot something, this would be the thing to screenshot, is ASP.NET Core has built-in open API support. You should be using map static assets instead of use static files now for the compression reasons that Daniel mentioned. And now they've got the hybrid cache that replaces the iDistributed cache and iMemory cache. That makes things easier to consume, as well as can plug into like a using like a local cache or a Redis cache or something like that. Another key takeaway is .NET 9 is faster than .NET 8, and .NET 9 at a minimum, I've seen people post about it's saved memory footprint by at least 20% compared to .NET 8. C# 13, like Patrick mentioned, there's not a ton of things that you'll probably use in your everyday coding, but a lot of the changes that they put in helped enable some of the performance improvements that we've seen in .NET 9. So Microsoft kind of made their stuff more for them than the everyday developer. And then EF Core 9 builds off of 8 to help increase your query efficiency as well, and some of those translations that Patrick mentioned. So yeah, anybody have any questions? I know we only have a couple minutes left. See, John is happy colorization is finally there. Yeah, any questions anybody has? If you want to drop it in the chat or unmute, either one's fine. All right, well, if there's no other questions, we've got our contact info up here. So feel free to reach out to us because I know some people don't always want to ask questions in a big group setting, but feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Otherwise, yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. And like I said, we'll get the slides out and recording out by end of day today. So yeah, thanks for coming, and yeah, we'll catch you next time.